At 37 years old, I decided to attend my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport, rented a car, and embarked on a 35-minute drive to my hometown. The road took me through a desolate stretch of rural landscape where the emptiness and the shadowy woods felt unsettling. As I neared town, about 3 miles out, I spotted someone on the side of the road, waving frantically. I slowed down and recognized him as Jim, an old high school friend. We hadn't seen each other in 2 decades, but he looked almost the same, just a bit older. Jim hopped into the car, and we began catching up, reminiscing about our high school escapades. It was comforting to reconnect with someone from my past. As we approached town, I invited Jim to join me for a drink at the VFW hall. Jim declined, asking to be taken to the outskirts of town instead. I knew his parents used to live not far away from my grandmother's house, so I headed that way. Jim directed me to drop him off at a mobile home park on the edge of town. With a final friendly goodbye, he stepped out into the darkness and disappeared from view. Later that night at the VFW, I shared with my old classmates that I had just picked up Jim and dropped him off. The room fell eerily silent. Even the karaoke singer stopped mid-note. My cousin's face went pale as she told me, "Barb, Jim died in a car accident on that very curve 8 years ago. We all attended his funeral." My stomach churned with disbelief. I needed to process what I had just heard. Mumbling an excuse, I went outside to the car. Hopping a few deep breaths would help. As I sat in the driver's seat, I noticed a newspaper on the passenger side. My heart nearly stopped when I saw that it was a local paper from 8 years ago, featuring Jim's obituary on the front page. The obituary detailed Jim's fatal car crash, how he had lost control and rolled into a ditch, dying instantly. I couldn't comprehend it. How could I have just seen him? I was desperate for answers. The next morning, I visited Jim's old home. Jim's mother, visibly aged and worn by grief, answered the door. I recounted my bizarre encounter with Jim the night before. Her eyes widened and she invited me in, explaining that after Jim's death, many people claimed to have seen him around town, especially near the site of the crash. Some believe it was his relentless spirit unable to move on. I asked if she had experienced anything unusual herself. Tears welled up in her eyes as she confessed that sometimes she felt his presence in the house, hearing his favorite song play on the radio even when it was off. It was as if he was still there, watching over them. Leaving her house, I was filled with a mix of sorrow and bewilderment. That night, I couldn't sleep as my thoughts consumed me by the eerie encounter with Jim. I wondered if I had tried to convey something important, or if there was a reason he had appeared to me. As the reunion wrapped up and I drove back home, I slowed down when passing the spot where I had picked him up. The road was empty, but an icy chill ran down my spine. I still have that old newspaper with Jim's obituary, a haunting memory of that night. Whenever I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that there is more to this world than what meets the eye. Maybe Jim's appearance was a final goodbye or a sign of unfinished business. Whatever the case may be, I'll never forget that night and the chilling mystery it left behind. The idea of camping alone in the forest filled me with a thrill I hadn't felt in years. The thought of escaping the city's chaos and immersing myself in nature was enticing. One Friday afternoon, I packed my gear, a tent, sleeping bag, and provisions and drove to the edge of the dark forest. As I parked and slung my backpack over my shoulders, a sense of adventure buzzed through me. The forest welcomed me with the rustling of tall trees and chirping birds. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the sun was casting a warm glow. As I was setting up a camp in a small clearing, the trees loomed overhead, and a gentle breeze carried out the scent of pine. I built a small campfire, its crackling flames promising warmth and comfort as night began to fall. As dusk enveloped the forest, an eerie silence settled in. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, staring at the star-filled sky, feeling a mix of solitude and contentment. But then, a rustle in the bushes shattered the call. My heart skipped a beat all of a sudden, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. But the noise grew louder and more persistent. Anxiety crept over me as I sat up and strained my eyes into the encroaching darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence answered me. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it towards the bushes, revealing nothing but swaying leaves. Trying to dismiss my unease, I added more wood to the fire and huddled closer to its warmth, though the sensation of being watched clung to me. Hours dragged on, and just as sleep began to claim me, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. My blood ran cold. This was no animal. Someone was approaching. I shouted again, "Who's there?" The first remained silent. Grabbing a large stick for protection, I stood by the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness. Then I saw it, a tall, shadowy figure emerging from the gloom. Just beyond the fire's reach, he stood there still, staring at me. I couldn't make out his features, but I felt his gaze like a physical presence. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to mask my terror. He didn't respond though, only continuing to watch me with an unsettling intensity. Panic surged through me. I had no idea who this man was or what he intended, but I knew I had to escape. I slowly backed towards my tent, keeping my eyes locked on the figure. Suddenly he began advancing towards me, his steps quick and purposeful. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted into the forest, my heart racing. The darkness was disorienting, and the branches clawed at my arms and face as I ran. I could hear him gaining on me, his footsteps growing louder and closer. I stumbled over a root and fell, pain shooting through my ankle. Desperate, I scrambled to my feet, limping as quickly as I could. The moonlight through the trees guided me towards what I hoped was safety. Just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst into a clearing and spotted a small cabin with lights on inside. I limped towards it, hanging on the door, shouting for help. Tears streamed down my face as an elderly man opened the door, startled by my frantic pleas. "There's someone after me. Please, let me in," I cried. He stepped aside, and I stumbled inside, collapsing on the floor. The man quickly shut and locked the door, peering out the window. "There is no one there," he said, turning to me with a look of concern. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I nodded vigorously, still trembling. He was chasing me. The old man handed me a blanket, saying I could stay the night and they'd sort things out in the morning. I thanked him, my voice barely a whisper, and wrapped myself in the blanket, finally feeling a semblance of safety. The old man sat nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the door. Exhaustion soon overcame me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When morning arrived, the old man and I went back to my campsite. There was no sign of the stranger, but the terror of that night lingered. I packed up quickly and left the forest, vowing never to camp alone again. The peaceful solitude I had once longed for had become a nightmare I would never forget. It was a quite Thursday evening at St. Anne's mental health facility, a place steeped in years of troubled souls and unsettling occurrences. The sun had long set, and the moon cast eerie shadows on the walls as I started my night shift. The facility, with its creaky floors and narrow hallways, seemed to exhale a sense of age and mystery. My shift began at 8 p.m., and the night was calm. I made my rounds, checking on patients and ensuring they were comfortable and had taken their medication. Everything seemed routine, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air, as if unseen eyes were watching me. Around midnight, while I was at the nurse's station updating patient records, the only light was from a dim disc lamp. Suddenly I heard a faint whisper. I paused, straining to make sense of it. The whisper was so soft, I thought it might be my imagination. I shrugged it off and continued my work, but then it came again, clearer this time, almost like someone softly calling my name. "Emily!" My heart began to race. I stood up and glanced around the empty hallway outside the station. The silence was unnerving. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks and decided to do another round. As I walked through the darkened hallways, the feeling of being watched intensified. Reaching room 307, where Mrs. Thompson, a typically quiet patient, resided, I noticed her doorway was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Mrs. Thompson was sitting by the window, her usual vacant stare replaced by an unsettling focus on the moon. She was humming a strange, unfamiliar tone. I gently touched her shoulder, and she turned to me with wide, fearful eyes. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The shadows, they came at night. They whisper. They want to take me." A chill ran down my spine as I tried to comfort her, but her words kept repeating. "The shadows, the shadows." Feeling more unsettled than ever, I left her room and headed back to the nurse station. As I walked, the lights flickered, and the whispering started again, louder this time. "Emily, Emily," it echoed through the hallways, making my heart pound in my chest. When I reached the nurse's station, the lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned it on, but the beam offered little reassurance. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by multiple voices. "Emily, come play with us. Join us." A cold breeze brushed past me, and papers scattered across my desk. My flashlight flickered, and I caught glimpses of shifting shadows at the edge of the light. In a panic, I decided to check the security cameras. The monitors were in a small room next to the nurse's station. As I turned on the screens, most showed empty hallways and rooms, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the camera view of the hallway outside room 307, shadows moved. Dark, shifting forms creeping towards the nurse station. Towards me. I couldn't breathe. I watched in horror as the shadows drew nearer. I grabbed the phone to call for help, but the line was dead. The whispers intensified. "Emily, join us forever." I backed into a corner, clutching my flashlight. The shadows reached the door, and an icy chill enveloped me. The door creaked open, and the room darkened even further. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the shadows vanished. The whispering ceased. I stood in the blinding light, trembling and gasping for air. I had no idea what had just transpired. But I knew one thing. This was no ordinary place. Something malevolent lurked here, feeding on the fear of both patients and staff. The rest of the night was a blur. I somehow completed my shift, but the dread never left me. When morning arrived, I handed over to the day nurse and left the facility as quickly as possible. I didn't tell anyone what had just happened. I mean, who would believe me? That night marked a turning point for me. I realized that some things defy explanation, and that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension. I never returned for another night shift at St. Anne's. The memory of that night lingers, and sometimes in the stillness of the night, I can still hear the haunting whispers.